Ratzinger emerges as one of the great defenders of reason, that man's mind can know certain things with certitude. I think that is perhaps his most enduring legacy in terms of the wider culture. One of the greatest figures of our time, one of the most consequential churchmen of the last 100 years, has died. Pope Benedict XVI, Joseph Ratzinger. He was one of the most balanced and nuanced and stabilizing figures in the life of the church, even though a lot of his critics would characterize him as a fire-breathing conservative. He really was anything but. He leaves an extraordinary legacy to both church and the wider society. There's so much we could say about him. In this brief tribute, I'll just mention a few simple things. The first is, and I think it's the most important thing to know about Joseph Ratzinger, that the central event of his life was the Second Vatican Council. He's a very young man, only about 35, when he was tapped to be a peritus, or a theological expert, by Cardinal Frings of Cologne. And in that capacity, he goes to Rome in 1962. He's there for all the sessions of the council. And despite his youth, he plays an outsized role at Vatican II, contributing mightily to the writing of many of the key documents, and then explaining the council to many of those who were in Rome and in the wider society. Here's the interesting thing. When he was at Vatican II, he would have been identified as one of the liberals, if you want, along with people like Rahner and Skilebex and Kung and others. And he was, calling for reform in the life of the church. And in that capacity, he was standing athwart conservatives who were resisting that renewal. But then, very shortly after the council, he begins to stand against Catholic progressivism that was trying to go beyond the text of the council, that was claiming itself as a separate magisterium. He saw that as equally problematic. And so the liberal of the mid-1960s becomes the conservative by the mid-1970s. But as Ratzinger himself, I think, very credibly said, his own views hadn't changed at all. And see, I think it's key to understanding his life and his writings. He was a man of the council. He was instrumental in the shaping of the conciliar documents, and he held off critics of both the left and the right, and held to the integrity of those great documents. Someone who was a very like mind was Karol Wojtyła, who was the Cardinal Archbishop of Krakow. Ratzinger would have known him from the council, but of course he came into closer contact with him during the conclaves of 1978. Well, when Karol Wojtyła becomes Pope John Paul II, he taps Ratzinger as his chief doctrinal officer. And I think, again, the way to understand the 25 years he spent with John Paul II in that very important capacity was to defend and give a proper interpretation to the Second Vatican Council. You can see it, by the way, very clearly in the Catechism of 1992, which is filled with the language and elan and spirit of Vatican II, and holds off both a hyper-conservatism and a hyper-liberalism. So Ratzinger, a man of the Second Vatican Council. Here's a second basic thing about him, that he was, it might seem a paradox, but he was a great man of reason. Now, I say a paradox because it's very clear he was a man of faith. As a priest, as a theologian, as a professor, as a bishop, as pope, he's obviously a man of the Bible, the church fathers, a man of faith. But see, here's the paradox. Precisely because of that, because he was a man of Christian faith, he was ipso facto a man of reason. Now, why? Because Christian faith declares that Jesus is not one figure among many, not just a great spiritual teacher among many, but rather the incarnation of the Logos, of the very reason of God, the Logos by which and through which God creates the world and imbues it with intelligibility. Well, see, what does that claim entail? It entails that any logical enterprise, science, philosophy, psychology, all the manifestations of culture in the measure that they reflect reason are naturally attuned to Christianity, are natural conversation partners for Christianity. And so it's precisely as a man of Christian faith, he became a man of reason. And at a time when many of the supposed avatars of reason, I mean the leading philosophers and so on in the culture, were adopting nihilistic positions or completely relativistic positions, Ratzinger emerges as one of the great defenders of reason, that man's mind can know certain things with certitude. I think that is perhaps his most enduring legacy in terms of the wider culture, that he was a man of reason. Look how it enabled him to dialogue with some of the leading figures, even an atheist philosopher like Jürgen Habermas. I might mention in this context the famously controversial speech he gave at University of Regensburg when he was Pope. And, it caused controversy because he cited a Islamic or a critique of Islam from the Middle Ages. But see, people miss the point of that talk. And it was just the one that I made, that Christianity's option for logos over mythos, logic or philosophy rather than mythology, the option for logos over sheer will, enabled Christianity to enter into vibrant dialogue with the wider culture. And that was a key theme for Joseph Ratzinger. Here's just the last thing I want to reflect on. That's his relationship to the Lord Jesus Christ. He's quoted often, and it's very reflective of his mind, that Christianity is not a philosophy, it's not an ideology, it's not primarily a system of ideas, but rather it's a relationship to a person. Christianity is a relationship to the living Christ. And I think it's fair to say anyone that knew him knew that he lived out of that relationship. He lived out of that friendship. I just met him very briefly one time, but I do have a personal memory from the time I was a visiting scholar in Rome in 2007. So I was there for an extended period. I made it a point. I don't think I missed many, if any of them. I went down every Wednesday to St. Peter's Square when Ratzinger, Benedict XVI, would give a general audience. And he would pray with the people and so on, but he also gave about a 25-minute talk on some aspect of theology or the spiritual life or one of the great figures of the tradition. And, his erudition and his intelligence and his command of languages was on clear display. But what was especially on display, I thought, in his gestures and his whole way of being and his manner of presenting himself, was that he was in love with the Lord. That he was not just an academic trading in ideas, but he was someone who loved the Lord Jesus Christ. Something else on a more personal level, again, his enemies called them their Panzer Cardinal, the Panzer tanks of the Second World War, or he was God's Rottweiler. Well, anyone that knew him, I didn't know him well personally, but I knew a lot of people who did know him. They just would sort of smile and shake their heads at that, because the real Ratzinger, Benedict XVI, was this very kind, very gentle, very soft-spoken academic, known above all for his goodness and his kindness. Many of the bishops who would cycle through Rome for the ad limina visits, when you go to see the Pope, but then during those visits, you also have conversations with the curial leaders. And almost to a person, they would say that during those years, the most impressive figure they dealt with was Joseph Ratzinger. His capacity to listen to everyone around the table and then to synthesize what they said in a very generous and charitable way. That's what struck them about, God's Rottweiler. I heard a story that typically during those years, at the end of a long day of work, what he loved most to do was to go to one of the local bookstores, and they circle the Vatican there, pick up the latest tome of theology, and then go to one of his favorite little restaurants and sit in the corner by himself and read and order dinner. And I think that's, of course, he was an introvert. He was an academic, and that's what he loved to do. I think, too, that the last 10 years or so of his life, when he lived in kind of isolation and retreat at the Vatican, it's probably the way Joseph Ratzinger really wanted to live most of his life, as a man of thought and prayer and reading and writing. But he was thrust by affairs and by history and by God's grace into a public role. And, thank God for it, because, as I say, he played this extremely influential, extremely stabilizing role in the life of the church. He blessed us in a thousand ways. And so as he passes from this world to the next, I would make bold to speak on behalf of the church and to say thank you to Joseph Ratzinger. Thank you to Pope Benedict XVI.